Our story begins on the morning of December 4th, 1872, when Oliver Deveau, a Canadian sailor, climbed onto the deck of an abandoned ship in the Atlantic Ocean. There was no sign of life on the ship. The only sounds were the wind rustling through the rigging beneath the deck and the creaking of the hull as it struck the waves. This was very, very strange. A ship in the ocean and not a trace of the crew inside. Oliver had no business being on this ship, but why was he there? Oliver was serving as second mate on a Canadian brigantine named Dei Gratia, and upon receiving orders from the captain, he had been sent to this ship, which was drifting approximately 400 miles east of the Azores, because something was amiss on that ship, something whose nature was unclear. The ship he climbed aboard, however, was an American brigantine. The ship he climbed, its name was the Mary Celeste. The Mary Celeste's rat was known, as was its crew. It had departed from the port of New York 27 days prior, and was expected to be en route to Genoa, Italy. On board were the captain, his wife, their 2-year-old daughter, and 7 crew members. So what was the ship carrying? There were approximately 1,800 barrels of industrial cargo on board. However, neither the industrial cargo nor any trace of the crew or the captain's family was found. The meals were still on the dining table, and the crew's belongings were exactly where they should have been. So where were the crew and the captain's family? According to the ship's final logs, specifically the ship's logbook, the last entry had been made 9 days earlier and 500 miles away. But what happened during those 9 days that caused these people to vanish? Oliver, upon seeing this, later testified at the Gibraltar Maritime Court that he had never seen anything like this in his life, and that the incident had left a profound impact on him. So what really happened on that ship? Here's the beginning of the story to find out what happened on the Mary Celeste. Good evening, and welcome back to History for Sleep. Tonight, we're not just studying the past. We're stepping into its silent, unsettling gaps. We'll explore a mystery that has haunted generations, a true anomaly that makes us question everything we thought we knew about the high seas. But before we go there, as always, I would love to know where in the world you are listening from and what time it is for you. Also, if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It helps others find their way here too, one sleepy soul at a time. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. Let your shoulders soften and your jaw unclench. Let your breathing slow down. Let your mind wander through the mysterious corridors of history. Let's begin. It was the winter of 1872. Conditions in the North Atlantic were growing increasingly difficult. Conditions were harsh. Ships setting sail from New York in November and December were heading toward the Mediterranean. However, this journey took weeks and left the crew at the mercy of the dreadful gray waters and prolonged storms. Of course, I mustn't forget the wind either. At sea, the wind could be both a savior and a force that brought about the crew's undoing. But the challenges weren't limited to weather conditions. The crew worked hard and got soaked. Due to a lack of spare clothing, they were forced to sleep in their wet clothes. Captains, too, were trying to cope with the stress. Their eyes were constantly on the barometer. And there were captains who hoped and prayed for the best conditions. A barometer is a device that provides a rough estimate of weather conditions. It is still used today. Let's take a closer look at the ship's chief officer, the captain. For our captain, Benjamin Spooner Briggs, this was not his first time on such a voyage. He had been on similar voyages before. He was 37 years old and had been doing this job since he was young. In other words, he was an experienced captain. Before the Mary Celeste, he had captained 4 other ships. He also knew the North Atlantic like the back of his hand. Benjamin was born on April 24, 1835, in the town of Wareham, Massachusetts. His family had been in the seafaring business for generations. In fact, all the men in his family were sent to sea. His father, Nathan Briggs, was a ship captain who, like him, had spent his life at sea. Nathan's 2 brothers were also captains on ships. Seafaring had become something of a tradition in this family. Just as other families farmed or ran shops, the Briggs family carried on this tradition at sea. We've already mentioned how experienced Benjamin was, but that wasn't the main thing that made him such a good captain. It was his cautious approach to everything. He also had influential people who cared about him, such as Horatio J. Sprague, the U.S. consul in Gibraltar. After the incident, he had corresponded with Washington for months to protect Benjamin's reputation. In a letter sent to Washington in 1873, Sprague wrote that Benjamin was a man of high moral character and a Christian who did not act on a whim. Sprague also noted that Benjamin did not enjoy strong beverages. This detail will come in handy later. In October 1872, Benjamin was offered a share in a brigantine named the Mary Celeste. I think the reason Benjamin accepted this deal was that the financial terms were actually better than they should have been. Or maybe he didn't know the ship's history. Well then, let's take a look at this ship's history together. Strangely enough, from its very launch, the ship seemed cursed. Its first captain, Robert McLaughlin, passed away from pneumonia just 2 days after taking command in June 1861. Just 2 days. Before it even left the harbor, the Amazon, as it was then known, had already seen its first loss. A few months after its maiden voyage, it collided with another ship in the Dover Strait off the coast of England, sustaining further damage. This time it didn't cause the captain's passing, it cost him his job. The captain was relieved of his duties. In 1867, it ran aground so severely on Cape Breton Island that voyages were canceled. It became a wreck, and as a wreck, it was sold for $1,750. Those who purchased the ship repaired it, renamed it, and 5 years later, in 1872, it took on the name we know today, the Mary Celeste, and was deemed seaworthy. In its history, the ship had witnessed the passing of a captain and had come close to sinking 3 times. For people involved in seafaring in the past, the history of the ship they were hired to work on was of great importance. Briggs took this into account, but he accepted the job anyway. There is one point that hardly anyone mentions when this story is told. Briggs had the interior of the Mary Celeste remodeled so he could accommodate his family on board. Benjamin's wife loved playing the organ, so he had a small cabin built on the ship just for her. He also prepared a place for his 2-year-old daughter, Matilda, to sleep. However, one person was missing from the family, his 7-year-old son, Arthur. Arthur had just started school, and his father decided to have him stay with his grandmother in Wareham so that his education wouldn't be interrupted. This decision would keep Arthur safe. Arthur Briggs grew up to become a businessman in New London, Connecticut. He passed away in 1934 without ever knowing what had happened to his family. He spent his entire adult life pondering this question, but never found an answer. Yet school had kept him safe. Now we're back where we started. The Mary Celeste had set sail from New York on November 7, 1872, on its final voyage. The ship's hold contained 1,701 barrels of commercial-grade denatured cargo and a crew of 10. On board were 37-year-old Captain Benjamin Briggs, his wife Sarah Elizabeth Cobb Briggs, their 2-year-old daughter Sophia Matilda, and 28-year-old First Mate Albert G. Richardson, who had previously sailed with Briggs and whom he trusted completely. Also on board were 25-year-old Second Mate Andrew Gilling from New York City, 23-year-old ship's cook Edward William Head, who had married just a few months before the voyage, and 4 German sailors, Volkert Lorenzen, Boy Lorenzen, Arian Martins, and Gottlieb Goodschad. The last letter written by Benjamin Briggs was mailed from New York on November 3, 1872, 4 days before the Mary Celeste set sail. In a letter he sent to his mother in Wareham, Benjamin mentioned that the ship was ready to leave the harbor, that he was doing very well, and that the crew was also doing well. "I hope we have a pleasant voyage," he had said. "I hope we have a pleasant voyage." Those were the last words anyone heard from him. And here we come to the part that has puzzled researchers for 150 years. While the Mary Celeste was loading its cargo in New York, there was another ship anchored and waiting in Hoboken, New Jersey. This was the Dei Gratia, the ship mentioned at the beginning of the story, whose second mate had climbed aboard the Mary Celeste. Their destinations were the same. Both ships were headed for the Mediterranean. Let's now turn our attention to the Dei Gratia. The captain of the Dei Gratia was a man named David Reed Morehouse, and he was acquainted with Benjamin. So where had they met? On November 3, 1872, the very day Benjamin wrote a letter to his mother, they had dinner together on the shore and chatted. That's where their acquaintance began. This took place 4 days before Benjamin set sail. Morehouse also set sail after Benjamin. Both were headed to the same destination and were following the same route. In the months that followed, many believed that what was discussed at that meal was a plan to deliberately heighten the mystery surrounding the Mary Celeste in order to commit insurance fraud. They thought everything was a hoax and that it was all fake. It was not a good theory, but the man who invented it had a lot of authority and a great deal of confidence in himself, and those two things together can do a lot of damage, and we will get to him shortly. The Dei Gratia left New York on November 15th, 8 days after the Mary Celeste, and Morehouse and his crew of 8 settled in for the winter North Atlantic crossing. On the morning of December 4th, 1872, the Dei Gratia was approximately 400 miles east of the Azores Islands when the helmsman John Johnson spotted a vessel in the distance. Johnson watched her for a few minutes and something looked wrong. She was yawing. That means she was swinging repeatedly off her course as if nobody was at the wheel correcting her heading. And she was doing it in a slow, consistent pattern that a helmsman recognizes immediately as the motion of a ship with no one steering. Johnson called First Mate Oliver DeVoe to the deck. DeVoe watched her through his glass for about 2 hours, and then he told Morehouse what he thought. Morehouse ordered a small boat lowered, and DeVale and 2 sailors rowed across to the unknown vessel in the December Atlantic. As DeVoe crossed the railing, he wasn't just stepping onto a ship. He was stepping into an enigma, a canvas of unanswered questions where every silent detail screamed of absence. DeVoe testified about what he found at the Gibraltar salvage hearings in January 1873, and his testimony was recorded word for word by the court stenographer, and it is the most important document we have from this entire case. DeVoe told the court, "I found no one on board, and I found the vessel in a fit condition to go to sea." He said the main hatch was on, and the forehatch and lazarette hatch were open. He said there was about 3.5 feet of water in the hold, but it did not appear to have been there long. He said the binnacle was knocked down, and the compass in it was damaged. He said the ship's clock had stopped. He said he found the log slate in the mate's cabin, and the last entry on it was dated November 25th, 1872, and it placed the ship at a position in the Atlantic approximately 500 miles west of where she now was, 500 miles. 9 days of sailing with no one at the wheel. And then DeVoe said something in his testimony that the newspapers picked up and repeated for decades afterward. He said the captain's table had the impression of a recent meal, and that a bottle of medicine was out on the table in the captain's cabin, and that the child's toys were on the floor of the cabin as if the child had just been playing with them. DeVoe told the court, "I attached no importance to the open medicine chest at the time, but in reflecting afterward it seemed to me that things had been left in a hurry." Things had been left in a hurry. Those are DeVoe's own words. And DeVoe also noted one more thing that nobody could explain then, and nobody has fully explained since. 9 of the cargo barrels in the hold were empty. Not cracked, not leaking, not broken. Just empty, as if their contents had somehow escaped without leaving any visible trace of where they had gone. But here is a comparison that makes the whole scene on the Mary Celeste concrete in a way that statistics cannot. Imagine coming home one evening and finding the front door open, and the lights on, and dinner half eaten on the table, and a child's shoes by the door and coats on the hooks. And everything exactly as it should be, except there is nobody there. Not in the kitchen, not in the living room, not upstairs. Nobody. And no note, and no sign of a struggle, and no indication of why they left or where they went. That is what DeVoe found on the Mary Celeste. And that is why the story has not gone away in 150 years. Morehouse made the decision that any experienced salvage captain in 1872 would have made. He split his crew and put DeVille and 2 men aboard the Mary Celeste, and both ships made the 600-mile passage to Gibraltar. Arriving on December 13th, 1872, the Mary Celeste was impounded by the Vice Admiralty Court. And waiting in Gibraltar was Frederick Sollyflood, the Attorney General, a man historian John Maxwell Wood would later describe as born to every advantage, yet made the least possible use of them, a figure whose arrogance would, paradoxically, etch this mystery into history. Sollyflood looked at the abandoned ship, and the missing 10 people, and the 9 empty cargo barrels, and he decided immediately that he knew what had happened. The crew had broken into the cargo, driven themselves into a violent frenzy, turned against the Briggs family and the officers, and then fled in the lifeboat. This was the first hurdle in understanding the Mary Celeste, a refusal to believe in the truly unknown, instead clinging to a neat, albeit flawed, explanation. But the truth, as always, was far more elusive. The cargo in those barrels was denatured industrial cargo, the kind used to fuel lamps and clean equipment. The kind that would make you blind or fatally ill long before it altered your state. And when a doctor examined the samples Solly Flood had collected as evidence, the doctor confirmed that consuming that cargo would have been essentially impossible. So Solly Flood abandoned theory number 1 and moved to theory number 2. Briggs and Morehouse had conspired together to split the salvage money, and that theory had the same problem as the first one. Briggs owned a share of the Mary Celeste. A share of the salvage would have been worth far less than his ownership stake in the ship itself. No rational man destroys his own property for a fraction of what it is worth. Solly Flood abandoned theory number 2 and moved to theory number 3. Morehouse had somehow gotten aboard the Mary Celeste before she sailed and caused the passing of everyone himself. Thus began the true ordeal, not just solving a mystery, but battling a narrative woven by a man convinced of his own infallible insight, creating a labyrinth of misinformation that would stand for a century and a half. The Gibraltar Maritime Court began proceedings in the Mary Celeste case on December 17, 1872, and the first person to take the stand was Oliver DeVoe. His testimony lasted exactly 3 days without interruption, and the person presiding over the hearing was Frederick Solly Flood. Solly Flood served as the Attorney General of Gibraltar and had held that position for a long time. He was a civil servant said to have been very intelligent since childhood, and to have made his life choices accordingly, though I have never heard anyone speak very highly of him. Furthermore, he viewed this incident as his moment to shine. This case was an opportunity for him to prove his superior intellect, if, of course, he was truly intelligent. In 1905, John Maxwell Wood, who investigated this case and wrote reports on it, described Solly Flood as follows: "A man born with every possible advantage, yet one who made the least possible use of them. A truly spot-on observation." Wood also noted that Solly Flood approached the hearings not as an investigation, but as a prosecution. Even after the very first witness had spoken, Solly Flood had already made up his mind. Here is Solly Flood's initial comment on the incident. The crew of the Dei Gratia had caused the passing of the people on the Mary Celeste, or perhaps the crew of the Mary Celeste had turned against one another, or perhaps Briggs and Morehouse had conspired together. Solly Flood wasn't entirely sure which version he believed, but he was certain that someone had committed a crime, and he was going to prove it. There's a problem with the claim put forward by Solly Flood. The Mary Celeste was carrying 1,701 barrels of denatured cargo. When DeVoe's crew boarded the Mary Celeste, 9 of these barrels were empty. These barrels had been filled with pure cargo. Solly Flood claimed that the crew had lost control after consuming all this cargo and harmed one another. However, there was a real problem with this theory. The cargo on board was denatured cargo. Furthermore, the addition of hazardous elements made it nearly impossible to consume. Even if one were to consume just enough of this special cargo from the Mary Celeste to alter their state, say, A small amount, it could lead not only to severe reactions, but also to severe vision loss, extreme illness, or even fatal consequences. The cargo goes through a processing stage, and the form found on the ship was in its purest state. Even the most hardened individual you know would suffer severe consequences if they sampled this pure cargo. However, since this data needed to be verified by an expert, a doctor named J. Patron was called in, and samples were taken from the pure cargo remaining at the bottom of the barrels on the ship, and the result remained the same. There was no chance that anyone who was exposed to this liquid would recover. Yet this result did not deter Sollyflood. He then put forward a second theory. He claimed that Benjamin and Morehouse had hatched a plan. He alleged that the stories of disappearance and passing were lies, and that they had staged their departure from the ship to split the rescue money. However, there was a major problem with this theory as well. Benjamin was a shareholder in the ship. A salvage award would be calculated as a fraction of the insured value of the ship and cargo, which together were worth approximately $46,000. And Briggs's ownership stake in the ship was worth considerably more than any fraction of $46,000. A man does not deliberately compromise his own property to receive a fraction of what it is already worth. Sollyflood abandoned that theory and moved to a third. In the third theory, however, Sollyflood claimed that Morehouse had infiltrated the Mary Celeste and caused the passing of the captain's family, including the crew. However, this theory only held up for a week. This is because the Dei Gratia, captained by Morehouse, had set sail 8 days after the Mary Celeste, and since it was a much slower ship, there was no way it could have caught up with the Mary Celeste during that time. Furthermore, there was no evidence that Morehouse had been anywhere near the Mary Celeste at any time before December 4th. 3 theories, 3 collapses. But Sollyflood had one more ace up his sleeve. According to Sollyflood, he had physical evidence that hostile incidents had occurred on the ship. This evidence had come to him from John Austin. John served as a ship inspector, and Sollyflood had sent him to investigate the Mary Celeste. According to John's claim, there were findings at the bow of the ship, that is, the front section, indicating that an incident had occurred involving an unidentified implement. And he also mentioned a reddish-brown stain on the captain's ceremonial item, which was located in the middle section between the deck and the captain's cabin. Sollyflood believed this to be a biological substance. The New York Times ran the story on its front page. The London Illustrated News also featured the story on its front page. Newspapers across Europe and North America ran headlines about the suspicious stains on the Mary Celeste's deck and a possible tragedy that might have taken place at sea. Subsequently, a doctor named T.J. McLean examined the stains under a microscope. McLean told the court that the substance found was not a biological fluid. He said these residues were likely rust or plant matter. However, he insisted in no uncertain terms that it was not a biological fluid. He also conducted an examination of the ship's bow and presented his findings to the court. The wear and tear on the bow, described as stress marks, was found on every ship that sailed the North Atlantic route. He explained to the court that it was perfectly normal for a wooden ship to be in this condition due to storms and rough waves. In other words, there was no incident of foul play. But of course, Solly Flood did not accept this conclusion. He initiated a correspondence that would last for months. He wrote letters to the Board of Trade in London, claiming that fraud had been committed in court and that he possessed very strong evidence. He also wrote that the salvage crew, that is, those aboard the Dei Gratia, should definitely not receive any compensation. The Board of Trade's response to him was that his evidence was insufficient. However, Solly Flood refused to accept defeat. He sent letter after letter. In the end, the court awarded the Dei Gratia crew a laughable sum of $1,700. Just think about it. $1,700 for a ship with an insurance value of $46,000. The Dei Gratia crew must have cursed Solly Flood to high heaven. In such a situation, the standard salvage reward would typically be between 1/6 and 1/3 of the insured value, which would amount to between $7,000 and $15,000. The derisory award of $1,700 was widely interpreted at the time as the court's way of expressing lingering suspicion about the Dei Gratia crew without having any actual evidence to act on. DeVoe, who had put himself in immense peril, sailing an undermanned derelict vessel 600 miles across the winter, North Atlantic, received less than $200 for his trouble. And here's where a young doctor in South Sea, England, enters the story. Arthur Conan Doyle was 24 years old in 1883, and he had recently set up a medical practice in Southsea, which is a suburb of Portsmouth. And the practice was not doing well, and Conan Doyle had a great deal of time on his hands. And he had been following the Mary Celeste case in the newspapers, and he decided to write a story about it. The story was called J. Habakkuk Jeffson's Statement, and it was published anonymously in Cornhill magazine in January 1884. And it was written as if it were the genuine testimony of a survivor of the Mary Celeste who had been allowed to live while everyone else was, eliminated by a radical passenger who was leading a dangerous conspiracy. Conan Doyle changed several details. He called the ship the Mary Celeste instead of the Mary Celeste. He gave her a full complement of lifeboats instead of the single missing boat DeVoe had found. And he described the ship as being in perfect order when found, whereas the real Mary Celeste had damaged sails and a broken binnacle and 3.5 feet of water in her hold. But the story was so well written and so convincing that many readers took it for a genuine document. And that is where the trouble started. Because Solly Flood, who was still in Gibraltar and still furious about the case, read J. Habakkuk Jeffson's statement in Cornhill magazine, and he wrote an official letter to the magazine's editors stating that the account was, quote, a fabrication from beginning to end, and demanding to know who had written it. Solly Flood also wrote to the U.S. Consul Horatio Sprague to warn him that the false account might damage relations between Britain and foreign countries. Sprague, who had spent 2 years defending Briggs's reputation against Solly Flood's own theories, found this somewhat rich. Conan Doyle was eventually identified as the author, but he was not yet famous, and the revelation caused no great scandal. But the damage was done. Cornhill magazine had a circulation of tens of thousands, and J. Habakkuk Jeffson's statement had been read across Britain and America. Doyle's fictional embellishments began to bleed into the actual facts, shaping public perception. To this day, many refer to her as the Mary Celeste, the name he conjured, not the Mary Celeste, the one proudly emblazoned on her bow. And the Mary Celeste herself, what happened to her after Gibraltar? She was returned to her owners and refitted and put back into service, and she sailed under a succession of different captains for the next 12 years. And none of them wanted the job very badly, because the ship had a reputation now, and sailors are a superstitious breed. And the reputation of the Mary Celeste was about as bad as a ship's reputation could get. She changed hands 17 times in 12 years. 17 different owners in 12 years is not a record that suggests confidence. And then, in January 1885, a captain named Gilman Parker ran her onto Rochelle Reef off the coast of Haiti and wrecked her deliberately. Parker had taken out an insurance policy on the ship and her cargo, and he filed a claim for the full value. But the cargo had been fraudulently inflated, and the insurance company's investigators established within weeks that the wrecking had been intentional. Parker was charged with barratry, which is the deliberate compromising of a ship by her captain for financial gain, and he was tried in Boston in 1885. The trial ended without a conviction because the jury could not reach a verdict. But Parker never recovered from the disgrace. He passed away a few months after the trial ended, broke. And the Mary Celeste, which had survived the North Atlantic and 12 years of nervous owners, and the suspicions of Solly Flood and the inventions of Conan Doyle, was left on the reef, and the sea took her apart piece by piece. But here is the thing about Solly Flood and the investigation that does not get said enough, because Solly Flood was wrong about everything he specifically alleged. The suspected biological fluid was rust. The marks on the bow were wear damage. The conspiracy theories were groundless, and the court rejected every one of his conclusions. But without Solly Flood, there is no mystery. A ship found abandoned in the Atlantic in 1872 with no remaining crew. And no explanation would have been a tragedy and a curiosity, and it would have been reported in the shipping news, and then forgotten the way hundreds of other maritime disasters were forgotten every year. It was Solly Flood's wild accusations that brought the New York Times and the London Illustrated News to the story. It was his insistence on foul play that kept the inquiry running for months and generated hundreds of pages of court testimony that historians have been reading ever since. And it was the combination of Solly Flood's insinuations and Conan Doyle's fiction that turned the Mary Celeste from a maritime statistic into the most famous ghost ship in history. The mystery was not discovered. It was manufactured partly by a pompous official in Gibraltar who could not admit he was wrong, and partly by a young doctor in Southsea who needed to pay his rent. The mystery of this event has been discussed for exactly 150 years, and it looks like it will continue to be discussed. During this time, many theories have been put forward, most of which don't make much sense, but there are some plausible ones among them. The list includes pirates, a waterspout, an undersea earthquake, and a giant squid. The squid theory is actually quite funny. Incidentally, the squid theory originated from a man named Lee Kay, who wrote about it in the Strand magazine in 1925. According to Kay's claim, a giant squid first attacks the ship and then drags the crew into the sea and causes their passing. He argues that this is why the missing individuals were never found, But if a giant squid had attacked that ship, everything inside would have been scattered everywhere. It wouldn't have remained in place. So as you can see, everyone is just saying whatever comes to mind. Kay also published this in a reputable magazine, but people just read it and move on. It can't really be said that many people believe it. However, as we said, not all theories are ridiculous. There is one more theory. The door to all theories that make sense leads to one question. Where did the contents of those 9 barrels go? At this point, we need to listen to a chemist. He has something to tell you about the denatured industrial cargo stored in red oak barrels on a ship that crossed the North Atlantic in November. The cargo evaporates. The type of cargo in the Mary Celeste hold was a volatile compound, and red oak is more porous than white oak. Yet white oak is used when you want to keep liquid inside a barrel. Red oak had been used to load the Mary Celeste at the port. As the ship was crossing the North Atlantic around November, the cargo may have evaporated from the barrels due to changes in air temperature. The cargo vapor is invisible in an enclosed wooden space, and this is the key point. It is extremely flammable. When science comes into play, the events can be explained, at least to some extent. Many people ask whether there was an explosion. Brian Hicks, who spent years investigating this incident and published his findings in 2004 through Ballantine Books. In New York, in a book titled Ghost Ship, The Mysterious True Story of the Mary Celeste and Her Missing Crew, said this is the wrong question to ask. Hicks pointed out that the real question is not whether there was an explosion. According to him, there was definitely no explosion or sustained fire. However, he also noted that a sudden blast was possible. The accumulation of a sufficient amount of cargo vapor in an enclosed space can lead to a phenomenon that chemists call a pressure event. This involves the gas erupting outward suddenly and violently, creating a brief flash without leaving burn marks on the wood. Because the vapor burns and dissipates in a fraction of a second before it has a chance to ignite the wood. And Hicks argued this is exactly what the physical evidence shows. Because look at what DeVoe actually found on that ship. The main hatch cover was off its position, not locked, not secured, sitting to one side as if it had been pushed or blown from below. The forward hatch was open. The lazarette hatch was open, and there was no fire damage anywhere on the ship. Not a scorch mark, not a burn, not a single piece of charred wood anywhere on the vessel. A sudden blast from accumulated cargo vapor in the hold would blow those hatches open and produce a loud bang, and possibly a brief flash at the hatch openings, and leave no fire damage, because there was no sustained fire, just a bang and a flash, and then nothing. And here is what Hicks thinks happened next. Briggs heard the bang. He felt the ship shudder. He saw the main hatch cover blow, and he had 1,700 barrels of industrial cargo in his hold, and his wife and his 2-year-old daughter were on board, and he did what any captain in that situation might do. He ordered the ship abandoned immediately. The lifeboat was launched in a hurry, which is why the falls were hanging loose over the side when DeVoe found the ship, and the 10 people got into the boat, and they took the navigational instruments and whatever else they could grab quickly, and they attached a long line from the boat to the ship, and they rowed away from what they believed was a vessel about to experience a sudden blast or burn. And they waited, and the ship did not burn. And Briggs would have wanted to get back aboard. And in that single agonizing snap of a rope, the impossible became brutally real. 10 souls, including a 2-year-old, were severed from their only hope, cast adrift into the vast, unforgiving December North Atlantic. And the North Atlantic in December does not forgive an open lifeboat. And here is a comparison that will make this real. In 1884, a British yacht called the Mignonette sank in the South Atlantic, and her 4 surviving crew members got into an open lifeboat. And after 19 days adrift, 3 of them caused the passing of the 4th, a 17-year-old cabin boy named Richard Parker. The case went to trial in Exeter, England, in November 1884, and became one of the most discussed legal cases in English history. But the point is not the extreme measures taken. The point is this: 4 professional sailors in an open boat in the South Atlantic in summer lasted 19 days before they started passing away. Briggs had 10 people in an open boat in the North Atlantic in December, with a 2-year-old child. But there's a problem with the cargo vapor theory, and it is the same problem that follows every theory about the Mary Celeste. It cannot be proven. The ship is on the bottom of the sea off the coast of Haiti, where Gilman Parker put her in January 1885. And even if she could be raised and examined today, the evidence of a vapor pressure event from November 1872 would have been compromised by 13 years of subsequent use, and then deliberate compromising, and then 140 years on the ocean floor. And the 9 empty barrels could have been loaded empty by mistake, or could have developed slow leaks that sealed themselves as the wood swelled in the damp air below decks, and the open hatches could have been opened by the crew for ventilation, which was standard practice on a vessel carrying volatile cargo in those years. The cargo vapor theory was examined by a team of researchers at University College London in 2006, who conducted controlled experiments with red oak barrels and denatured cargo in an enclosed space. And the results supported Hicks's argument that a pressure event without sustained fire was physically plausible. Plausible, not proven. Plausible, and here's the thing nobody found: the missing individuals. Not one of the 10 people who were on the Mary Celeste on November 25, 1872, was ever seen again. Not Briggs, not Sarah, not Sophia, who was 2 years old, not Richardson or Gilling or Head or any of the 4 German sailors. No trace washed ashore anywhere on the Atlantic coast. No wreckage from the lifeboat was ever positively identified. The U.S. Consul, Horatio Sprague, who had spent 2 years fighting to protect Briggs's reputation, made formal inquiries through official channels for months after the salvage hearings ended, and found nothing, and eventually accepted that Briggs and his crew had passed away. And Arthur Briggs, the 7-year-old boy who had stayed behind in Wareham for school, made his own inquiries as an adult, and he found nothing either. DeVoe gave an interview to a New York newspaper in 1886, 14 years after he boarded the Mary Celeste, and the reporter asked him what he thought about the most. And DeVoe said it was not the mystery that troubled him, it was the certainty. He said whatever happened to those people, it happened fast. And he said the people on that ship did not have time to write a note or leave a message or do anything at all that would tell anybody what was happening to them. And he said, I think about that. I think about that. That is a man who spent 14 years thinking about 10 people who disappeared on a ship he was the last person to see. And he said the worst part was not the not knowing. The worst part was knowing it was fast, and Oliver Deveau, who had sailed that abandoned ship 600 miles across the winter Atlantic with 2 other men and received less than $200 for the work, went back to sea and kept sailing, and was consistent in every detail of his account across 30 years of interviews. And the consistency is why serious researchers have generally accepted his testimony as reliable. And David Morehouse, the captain of the Dei Gratia, on whom Solly Flood had tried to pin a foul play charge, kept sailing and passed away in 1904 at the age of 66, having never been charged with any crime. And the cloud Solly Flood had tried to attach to him faded slowly over the years after the inquiry closed. And Frederick Solly Flood, who had invented the 3 theories and watched all 3 collapse, and had continued writing letters to the Board of Trade insisting he was right long after the board had stopped responding, retired from his position and passed away. And his name would be completely forgotten today, except for the Mary Celeste. The man who manufactured the mystery of the Mary Celeste is the only reason anyone remembers his name. And Arthur Briggs passed away in New London, Connecticut, in 1934 at the age of 60. And he never found out what happened to his father and his mother and his little sister and the lifeboat they were in on the North Atlantic in December 1872. And that is the honest end of the story. 10 people got into a lifeboat, and the line broke, and the sea took them. And the Mary Celeste sailed on without them for 9 days and 500 miles until Deveau found her. And it is a history that deserves to be remembered. And so concludes the story of the Mary Celeste, a ship that departed New York with 10 souls on November 7, 1872, only to be discovered 27 days later, 400 miles east of the Azores abandoned. Meals lay untouched, a child's toys scattered, oilskins hung on hooks, yet not a single living being remained aboard. And the best explanation we have after 150 years of research is that 9 barrels of cargo evaporated in the hold, and the vapor accumulated, and there was a bang and a flash, and a captain who loved his wife and his 2-year-old daughter made a decision in a matter of seconds that turned out to be the last decision he ever made, and the line broke. And the sea did the rest. Deveau gave his last known interview about the case to a journalist in Yarmouth, Nova Scotia, in 1903, 31 years after he boarded the Mary Celeste, and the journalist asked him if he had ever made peace with what he had found on that ship, and Deveau said he had not. He said some things you do not make peace with. And in those words lay the true resurrection of the Mary Celeste, not a solved mystery, but a haunting echo of 10 vanished lives, leaving an indelible mark on those who touched its periphery, a testament to the mysteries we carry, unsolved, within us. And Arthur Briggs, the 7-year-old boy who stayed behind in Wareham because of school, passed away in New London, Connecticut in 1934 at the age of 60. And the last interview he ever gave about his father was to the New Bedford Standard Times in 1931. and the reporter asked him what he believed had happened on the Mary Celeste, and Arthur Briggs said he did not know. He said nobody knows. He said my father was a careful man and a good sailor, and whatever happened to him, it was not his fault. And he said, I have thought about it every day of my life, and I am no closer to an answer than I was when I was 7 years old. I have thought about it every day of my life. Arthur Briggs was 68 years old when he said that, and it is late now. And if you have made it this far, you know more about the Mary Celeste and Benjamin Briggs and Oliver Deveau, and the pompous Attorney General of Gibraltar who manufactured a mystery out of rust stains and his own certainty that most people will learn in a lifetime. And the North Atlantic is still out there, cold and gray and indifferent. The same water that closed over the lifeboat in December 1872 is still moving. And somewhere on the bottom of the sea off the coast of Haiti, the ribs of the Mary Celeste are still there. What is left of them? Let your breathing slow down. Let your shoulders drop. Let the ocean do what it does, which is hold everything quietly and give almost nothing back. I hope you enjoyed this episode of History for Sleep, and if you did, please go ahead and click that thumbs up button and leave a comment below telling us what you think happened to the crew of the Mary Celeste. And I read every comment and I will be happy to respond. And if you know someone who likes falling asleep to forgotten history, please share this with them. And if you would like more stories like this one, all you need to do is subscribe to History for Sleep. Good night.